Hello, friends and viewers. This is John Burness, or Jonathan Burness, on a very, very special addition to my History of Poetry lecture series, where I'm basically going to very thoroughly go over the reason I'm doing this in the first place. Because I'm sure it might strike people when it strikes my family and my friends, why I'm doing something so niche with such a small audience, teaching the history of poetry. And hopefully the title slash maxim will answer that. And I'm going to delve into all of the reasons why I think this title is so. The history of poetry is the history of ideas. And of course, ideas lead to everything. Human beings are nothing without ideas. So we're going to explore this motto. We'll see that many groundbreaking ideas in science and human knowledge first appeared not in labs or textbooks, but in poetry. From ancient myths and epic poems to Enlightenment era verses, poetry has been a creative laboratory for ideas. In many early societies, poetry and myth were the primary vessels for knowledge. So think of how creation stories or epics encode philosophical and scientific notions. Goethe himself, when I say Goethe, I mean the great German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, himself observed that quote unquote science had developed from poetry, recognizing that before formal science, people explained the world through narrative and verse. So as we're going to journey from antiquity to the Enlightenment, mostly in the West, with a couple of global detours, we'll find poets foreshadowing concepts that have later changed the world, and each slide will highlight a poet or a poem that anticipated a major idea or invention. So let's dive in and see how poetic imagination has often outrun reality, planting seeds for future innovation. Our first example comes from the great German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Born in 1749 and died in 1832. He was a towering literary figure of the Enlightenment. Goethe had a keen interest in science and often laced his writings with philosophical insights. And one striking quote of his reads, quote unquote, "Energy will do anything that can be done in the world, and no talents, no circumstances, no opportunities will make a two-legged animal a man without it." In other words, energy, the capacity to do work, is the fundamental ingredient for achievement. Goethe was speaking metaphorically about human vitality and effort, but his words resonated beyond metaphor. And then decades later, Nikola Tesla, the inventor who tamed electric current, found inspiration in Goethe's words. Tesla even claimed that an excerpt from Goethe spurred him to finally devise his alternating current motor. So just imagine that a German poem's line helping give birth to the modern electrical era. So Tesla, who was a highly scientifically minded man, was moved by Goethe's poetic insight into the primacy of energy. So this beautifully illustrates how a poetic idea, and in this case the idea that harnessing energy can transform the world, directly fueled a concrete invention. So Goethe's poetic maxim became quite literally electric in its impact on human history. And that's thanks to poetry. Goethe gives us another gem of foresight with his observation on knowledge and doubt. He wrote, quote unquote, "We know accurately only when we know little. Doubt grows with knowledge." At first, that sounds paradoxical. Shouldn't knowing more increase confidence? But Goethe's point, however, is profoundly true. A little knowledge can make people feel very certain, whereas a lot of knowledge often makes people humble. This happens because truly informed people become keenly aware of complexities and of all they don't know. If you've ever talked to a beginner who's supremely confident versus an expert who's cautious in their claims, you've seen this in action. And where this has changed the world is in modern psychology. we have a name for a related phenomenon, the Dunning-Kruger effect. As studies have shown, people with limited knowledge in a domain often grossly overestimate their own competence, while experts tend to underestimate theirs. So the green curve on the slide's graph illustrate this, how confidence peaks early when competence is low, and then troughs, valley of despair, before rising gradually as competence truly develops. Goethe intuitively grasped this dynamic long before social scientists. So his poetic line essentially captures the heart of Dunning-Kruger, that true understanding brings a healthy dose of doubt. So it's remarkable that, again, a 19th century poet could distill a cognitive truth that we only formally named in the late 20th century. This example again shows poetry's power to glean deep insight into human cognition and learning well ahead of scientific discoveries. So traveling back over 2,000 years, we meet Lucretius, a Roman poet and philosopher from the 1st century. So Lucretius wrote an epic 6-book poem, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, which is essentially a scientific treatise in poetic form. In it, he lays out the principles of atomism, the idea that everything in the universe is composed of tiny, indivisible particles. With vivid Latin verse, Lucretius describes how an infinite number of invisible atoms move in the void, swerving and colliding to create all phenomenon. He even explains that there is no divine hand directing these processes. It's all natural law operating through atoms and void. So this was pretty radical for antiquity. At the time, such ideas were known in Greek philosophy. You know, Democritus and Epicurus had theorized atoms, but Lucretius preserved and popularized them in a beautiful poem. What's astonishing about this is how accurately this ancient poem foreshadows modern science. The atomic nature of matter, as Lucretius poetically detailed, is now a foundation of physics, though it wasn't experimentally validated until the 19th and 20th centuries. When Lucretius's work was rediscovered in the Renaissance, it helped ignite scientific thinking by freeing minds to imagine a universe governed by natural laws rather than capricious gods. So thus, a poet from antiquity effectively predicted the atomic theory, using only the power of imagination and reason. It's a superb early case of poetic ideas leading the way for scientific ideals. Our next example of prophetic poetry comes from ancient India in the year 499 CE. So a brilliant mathematician and astronomer named Aryabhata wrote a work called the Aryabhatiya. So what's fascinating is that Aryabhata wrote this treatise in verse form, Sanskrit shlokas, or couplets, that condensed complex astronomical knowledge into memorable poetry. One of these verses was stunningly ahead of its time. Aryabhata declared that the Earth is rotating on its axis, and that this rotation explains why the sun, stars, and planets appear to move across the sky. To paraphrase this verse, quote unquote, just as the relatively fixed pole star makes it seem as though the heavens rotate, it is actually the Earth itself that rotates, carrying us and making the stars appear to rise and set. This is essentially a heliocentric perspective, acknowledging that Earth spins daily and even suggesting it orbits the sun, which was way outside mainstream thought in this era. In Europe, over 1,000 years later, Copernicus famously proposed heliocentrism in 1543, and Galileo provided evidence in the 17th century, so often at great personal and professional risk. Yet, Aryabhata's poetry had quietly captured this truth a millennium earlier. It's a powerful reminder that advanced ideas germinated globally. Aryabhata's work didn't immediately revolutionize world astronomy. His writings stayed mostly within the Indian and later Islamic scholarly tradition. But in hindsight, we see a poet scientist getting in right far ahead of time. This underscores that the history of ideas isn't just a Western story. Um, Poetry from across the world, like Aryabhata's Sanskrit verses, carried insights that modern science has confirmed hundreds or even up to 1,000 years later. Jumping forward to the late 18th century, we encounter Erasmus Darwin, who was a polymath. He was a physician, inventor, and natural philosopher, but he was also a poet who believed that poetry could convey scientific ideas. In 1803, Erasmus Darwin published The Temple of Nature, which is an epic poem that reads like a vision of natural history. In it, he lyrically describes the origin and progression of life. For example, he writes how organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, these, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire, and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation sprung, and breathing realms of fit and feet and wing. So it's a beautiful poetic summary of evolutionary development. So life starts in the ocean as microscopic organisms, then through many generations gains new abilities and forms, leading eventually to fish, land animals, birds, the fin and the feet and wing. And it's important to remember that this was penned in 1803, decades before Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species in 1859. Erasmus Darwin essentially intuited the idea of evolution by natural laws. He lacked the mechanism of natural selection that his grandson would later provide, but he clearly envisioned a branching, developing tree of life. Moreover, Erasmus Darwin's poem even touches on ideas like competition and war, pestilence, and disease, regulating populations, which is eerily close to the survival of the fittest. It also speculates about the cosmos, a sort of Big Bang and cosmic evolution. So his work shows poetry as a vehicle for scientific hypothesis. While the Temple of Nature didn't spark an immediate scientific revolution, it planted conceptual seeds. It demonstrates that the poetic imagination was pushing towards evolutionary theory well before the scientific establishment caught up. Erasmus Darwin's poetry stands as a prophetic bridge between Enlightenment science and the revolutionary ideas that have defined the 19th century. Our final example brings us to the mid-19th century with a writer famed for mystery and horror, Edgar Allan Poe. It may surprise you, but Poe wrote an essay-length poem titled Eureka and subtitled a prose poem, which was all about cosmology, the origin, evolution, and fate of the universe. And what Poe imagined was astonishingly ahead of its time. So in Eureka, published in 1848, Poe proposed that the universe began as a single primordial particle that burst or diffused to form all matter. This sounds very much like what we now call the Big Bang Theory, which wasn't formulated by scientists until the 20th century. He also speculated about other forward-looking ideas. Poe wrote that there might exist stars that emit no light, which is essentially describing black holes or objects so massive that even light can't escape. Talked about a force that repels matter, counteracting gravity, which evokes the concept of dark energy or the universe's expansion pressure. He even considered the possibility of multiple universes and a cyclic universe that might collapse and explode anew. It's hard to overstate how weirdly prescient this was. In Poe's day, the accepted wisdom was that the universe was static and eternal. The idea of a universe that began in an instant and that might end was unheard of, or at the very least, it wasn't taken seriously. So, understandably, Eureka was met with puzzlement and scorn by his contemporaries. One critic called it errant fudge, and many thought Poe had gone off the deep end. Yet, modern commentators have noted that Eureka, according to the Scientific American, anticipates ideas remarkably similar to those of modern physics and cosmology. So Poe insisted it was not a scientific work, but a work of art. He presented it as a poem only. Nonetheless, it shows how a poet's intuition and imaginative reasoning glimpsed truths that science would later explore. So, in the history of ideas, Poe's Eureka stands as a testament to the potential of poetic thought to roam into the cosmic and the profound, long before empirical evidence caught up. So, in closing, what can we learn from these examples? First, that poets are often visionaries of the first order. Time and again, we've seen how a poet's creative intuition lit the way for later intellectual revolutions. The history of poetry we've sampled from Lucretius's ancient atomist epic to the Sanskrit verses of Aryabhata to Erasmus Darwin, Poe, and more. It reads like a timeline of ideas waiting to happen. So these poets crystallized in beautiful language the notions that atoms make up matter, that the earth spins in space, that life evolves from simple forms. That confidence and ignorance often go hand in hand, and that the universe might have begun in a flash of creation. So, such ideas expressed in poetry were seeds planted in the collective mind of humanity. Eventually, with time and the development of the scientific method, these seeds took root as full fledged theories and discoveries. So, this tells us that the realms of art and science are not opposed but deeply intertwined. So, historically, imagination precedes knowledge. Before we can rigorously prove or engineer something, we often dream it in art or literature. So Goethe and others believed that science and poetry, which diverged in the modern era, might reunite in our understanding. And indeed, when we consider fields like theoretical physics or astrobiology today, there's still a strong element of creative speculation or a poetic leap of faith involved in conceptualizing things unseen. So as we move forward as a species, I think it's worth remembering that the next groundbreaking idea might already be stirring in someone's poem, novel, or artistic vision right now. So the history of poetry, I will say it again, the history of poetry is the history of ideas, and it continues to this day. So that is the best reason that I can think of as to why we should give a lot more merit and seriousness to poets and visionaries, which, because as the history I've showed you has shown, they are gifting us with a glimpse of tomorrow's world. And these are all the websites I used. It was pretty ugly how unfortunately, how I panned it out. But these are all the websites I used for my research. I really hope that I inspired anyone watching, especially to take poetry more seriously. That's really the main goal of this lecture and this lecture series. And thank you very much for watching. And I will end off with that quote one more time. The history of poetry is the history of ideas. Thank you and goodbye.